Saren had stopped counting the days behind the mask a long time ago. Iron pressed against her cheekbones like a second jaw, bolted at the temples, cutting into the soft skin behind her ears, where the metal had long since rubbed the flesh raw. She could breathe through the narrow slit at the mouth, barely, and see through the two uneven eye holes that gave her just enough of the world to know she did not want to see it. The chains on her wrists were heavier than the ones on the three prisoners ahead of her. She did not know why. She had never been told why she was different, only that she was. The soldiers dragging the line forward did not look at her. They never did. She was cargo, anonymous and unremarkable, except for the mask that made her remarkably noticeable and the silence she carried like a second skin. The corridor opened into light, and Saren flinched. Even through the narrow slits, the brightness was an assault after years of dim cells and windowless stone. The air changed, too. It lost the stale, mineral taste of underground and filled instead with something cleaner, something that carried traces of wood polish and candle wax and the faint, living warmth of bodies. The throne room of Greythorn Castle was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected stone and shadows, something cold and brutal to match the reputation of the man who ruled from it. Instead, the hall was vast and lit by a wall of arched windows that let in the pale afternoon light in long, slanting beams. Dust motes drifted in the gold like flecks of something precious, and the floor beneath her bare feet was smooth, worn marble that had been walked on by thousands. It was beautiful, and the beauty of it made something inside her ache because she had not seen anything beautiful in a very long time. There were people, dozens of them, advisors and captains and servants lining the walls like an audience waiting for a performance. Their gazes moved over the line of prisoners with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity to practiced indifference. Saren kept her eyes forward, her shoulders low, her breathing shallow behind the iron. She had learned long ago that the safest way to survive scrutiny was to become as small and unremarkable as possible. At the far end, elevated on a dais that was modest compared to the man sitting on it, was the throne, and on the throne sat the Alpha King of Ashenmoor. Saren's legs nearly gave out. King Calderbrine was not what she had expected either. He was younger than the rumors suggested, though the weariness in his face aged him beyond his years. His hair was dark and slightly too long, falling across his forehead like he had forgotten to care about it. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and his shoulders were the kind of broad that made the ornate chair beneath him look like it had been built for a smaller man. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Pale gray, almost silver, and utterly empty. They swept over the line of prisoners with the flat, disinterested gaze of a man reviewing inventory. He did not see people. He saw problems to be sorted. The captain at the front of the line was speaking. Something about border skirmishes and a stronghold that had fallen. Lord Voss's compound. She gathered from the fragments she could hear past the blood rushing in her ears. These prisoners had been recovered from the lower cells. Most were laborers or servants pressed into Voss's service against their will. The king's hand moved in a dismissive gesture. Process them. Release those with no ties to Voss's campaign. The rest go to the magistrate. His voice was low, rough at the edges, and completely devoid of emotion. It landed on Saren's skin like cold water, but beneath the cold, she felt something else. A strange, involuntary tug deep in her abdomen, as if something inside her had shifted at the sound of him. She pressed it down immediately, buried it beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the dull, practiced numbness that had kept her alive this long. The line shuffled forward. One by one, the prisoners were assessed, spoken to, waved through. Saren watched through the narrow slits of her mask and felt her heartbeat climb with every step closer to the throne. Then it was her turn. The captain glanced at her and hesitated. This one was kept separate, Your Majesty, masked and chained apart from the others. Lord Voss's personal prisoner, from what we can tell. No name, no record, no one in the compound would say who she was. The king's gaze found her. For a moment, those empty silver eyes rested on the mask, on the iron bolted to her face, and something flickered in them. Not pity, not curiosity, something sharper and more involuntary, like a reflex he could not quite suppress. Then it was gone. Send her with the others, he said, looking away. The guard behind Saren gripped her arm and pulled her toward the side door. She stumbled, her bare feet catching on the edge of a cracked tile, and the momentum pitched her forward. She threw her hands out to catch herself, but the chains made the movement clumsy and wrong. Her shoulder hit the edge of the raised platform, and the impact jolted through her skull and into the mask. She heard the bolt snap. The sound was small but sharp, a metallic crack that echoed through the sudden silence of the room. The iron plate over her left cheek swung loose, hanging from the remaining bolt on the opposite side, and cold air hit skin that had not been exposed in years. Saren gasped, blinking against the sudden brightness, and reached up instinctively to cover her face. She was not fast enough. The king had turned at the sound of the snap. His gaze landed on her exposed cheek, on the mark that blazed across her cheekbone in a pattern of deep gold and violet that no tattoo artist could replicate, no paint could imitate, no human hand could forge. The sacred mark of a fated bond. His mark, every wolf in the bloodline of Ashenmoor's kings was taught to recognize it. A geometric spiral of interlocking crescents that pulsed faintly with light, like something alive beneath the skin. It appeared only once in a generation, only on one person in the entire world, and it meant one thing. Mate. The king rose from his throne so fast the chair scraped backward across the stone with a sound that made everyone flinch. Stop, he said. The word cracked through the hall like a whip. Every guard, every advisor, every servant froze. Saren stared up at him from the floor, her hair tangled across her face, her chains pooling around her wrists, one half of the shattered mask still clinging to her jaw. She could see his expression now, fully and clearly, and what she saw terrified her more than anything in Lord Voss's cells ever had. He was looking at her like the ground had just opened beneath his feet. They did not take her to the cells. They did not process her with the others. Instead, two guards she had never seen before escorted her through corridors that grew progressively finer, the rough stone giving way to polished wood, then to tapestried walls and carpeted floors that felt foreign beneath her bare, calloused feet. No one spoke to her. No one told her where she was going. The guards walked on either side of her with the careful alertness of men who had been given very specific instructions by someone they were afraid of displeasing. The room they left her in was small but clean. There was a bed with actual sheets, a wash basin with warm water, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard full of green things, growing things. Trees with leaves that shifted in the breeze, flower beds in deliberate tended rows, a stone bench beneath a climbing rose that had been allowed to grow wild along the courtyard wall. Saren stood in the center of the room and pressed her hands to her mouth and tried very hard not to cry. She failed. The tears came fast and silent, years of them, soaking into her palms and dripping through her fingers onto the clean floor. She cried for the girl she had been before the mask. She cried for the years of iron and darkness and the slow, grinding erosion of everything she had once believed about herself. She cried until her chest was hollow, until the sobs turned dry and soundless, and then she washed her face in the basin and stared at her reflection in the copper mirror above it. She barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than she remembered, the bones more prominent, the skin pale from years without sunlight. The raw marks from the mask's edges traced angry red lines along her temples and behind her ears, but it was the mark that drew her gaze. The golden violet spiral on her left cheekbone that she had carried since birth, the one her mother had hidden with cloth when she was a child, the one Lord Voss had locked behind iron the moment he saw it. She did not know what it meant. Her mother had never told her, had only said it was dangerous, that people would want to use her if they saw it, and that she must never let anyone look. Then her mother had disappeared, and Saren had been alone, and eventually Voss's men had found her. She traced the mark with her fingertip. It pulsed faintly at her touch, warmer than the surrounding skin, as though it had its own heartbeat. It had always done that, for as long as she could remember. A quiet, patient glow that never fully went away, even behind the iron. As a child, she had thought it was alive. As a prisoner, she had thought it was mocking her. Now she did not know what to think. A knock at the door startled her so badly she bit her tongue. "May I come in?" A man's voice, calm and measured. Saren opened the door to find a tall man with sharp features and watchful dark eyes. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to standing beside power without wielding it. "My name is Hadric," he said. "I serve as the king's second, his beta." Saren stared at him and said nothing because she had learned in Voss's cells that silence was safer than words. Hadric studied her for a moment, his gaze moving to the mark on her cheek, then back to her eyes. "Do you know what that mark is?" he asked gently. "Dangerous," Saren said. "That is all I was ever told." Something shifted in Hadric's expression. Sympathy, maybe, or the effort of suppressing it. "It is a sacred bond mark," he said. "It identifies the fated mate of the ruling Alpha bloodline. It has not appeared in 4 generations." The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, her shoulders hitting the wall behind her. "That is not possible," she whispered. "I understand this is difficult to hear," Hadric said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "But the mark is unmistakable, and the king has confirmed it. He recognized it immediately." "The king," Saren repeated, her voice hollow. "Your king thinks I am his mate." "The mark does not lie," Hadric replied. "But I want to be honest with you. The king has asked me to verify the mark's authenticity through the court healer before any decisions are made. This is as much for your protection as his." "My protection," Saren echoed faintly. "There are people who would exploit a false claim, and there are people who would harm a true one." That second sentence landed heavily. Saren thought of Lord Voss, of the Iron Mask, of the years spent in darkness, and understood with nauseating clarity exactly what Hadric meant. "Someone already knew," she breathed. "Voss. He knew what this mark was. That is why he kept me hidden." Hadric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is our suspicion, yes." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. She could feel the edges of panic sharpening in her periphery, the old familiar constriction in her throat that came with the feeling of being trapped. She forced herself to breathe. "What happens now?" Saren asked. "Now," Hadric said, "you meet the court healer. And then, depending on what she confirms, the king will wish to speak with you." The walk to the healer's quarters felt like walking through deep water. Every step took effort. Every corridor felt too long, too bright, too full of people who stared at her bare feet and her scarred temples and the impossible mark blazing on her cheek. The healer was a woman named Marin, small and silver-haired with hands that moved like birds and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She sat Saren down in a bright, herb-scented room, tilted her chin toward the light, and studied the mark in silence for a long, breathless minute. "It is real," Marin said finally, sitting back. "Sacred geometry, bioluminescent pigmentation beneath the dermis, responsive to proximity with the alpha bloodline. This is not a forgery." "Responsive to proximity," Saren repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means the mark will intensify when you are near the king. It will glow brighter, pulse faster, and if I am correct, you may have already noticed certain physical responses in his presence. Warmth, heightened awareness, difficulty breathing." Saren thought about the throne room. The moment his eyes had found her through the broken mask, the way her lungs had seized and her skin had flushed hot beneath the iron, the strange tug in her abdomen she had refused to examine. "That was just fear," Saren said. Marin gave her a look that suggested she was not fooling anyone but chose not to argue the point. "There is something else you should know," Marin continued, her voice dropping lower, and the shift in tone made Saren's stomach clench. "Something about the king." Saren waited, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "Not yet," Marin said, almost to herself. "Not until I have spoken with Hadric. But soon." She paused, met Saren's eyes, and the weight in that gaze was heavy enough to crush. "Stay in the castle. Do not try to leave. And do not be alone with the king until I have had that conversation." Saren's blood ran cold. "Why not?" Marin did not answer. She simply squeezed Saren's hand and turned back to her work, and the silence she left behind was far more terrifying than any answer could have been. Saren did not sleep that night. She lay in the clean bed with the clean sheets and stared at the ceiling and replayed Marin's warning over and over until the words lost all meaning and reformed into something worse. "Do not be alone with the king." Why? What would happen? Was he dangerous? Was she? By morning, her eyes were gritty and her thoughts were frayed. And when Hadric appeared at her door again, she did not even flinch. "The king wishes to see you," Hadric said. "Your healer told me not to be alone with him," Saren replied flatly. Something complicated crossed Hadric's face. "You will not be alone. I will be present, and so will Marin." That should have been reassuring. It was not. The king's study was a room built for work, not comfort. Maps covered every surface. Correspondence was stacked in precise towers across the desk. The windows were narrow and high, letting in sharp columns of light that fell in geometric patterns across the stone floor. The walls were lined with weapons and campaign banners, and the air smelled of ink and old leather. Calder stood behind the desk with his back to the door when they entered. He did not turn around immediately, and in the pause, Saren studied the rigid line of his spine, the tension locked into his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk like he was holding himself in place. When he turned, his eyes went straight to the mark on her cheek, then away, like looking at it cost him something. The mark responded to his attention with a flush of warmth that spread down her neck and into her collarbones, and she had to resist the urge to press her hand over it. "Sit down," he said. His voice was rougher than yesterday, scraped raw at the edges. Saren sat. Hadric and Marin flanked the door like sentinels. The silence stretched. Calder looked at Hadric, then at Marin, then at the desk, then finally, reluctantly, at Saren. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room," he said. Saren's heart hammered against her ribs. That is never a good start, she thought. "Since the border war," Calder said, his voice carefully controlled, "I have been experiencing episodes." He paused, and she could see the effort it took to continue. "My wolf is destabilizing." Saren blinked. She was not sure what she had expected him to say, but it was not that. "Every alpha carries the beast." Calder continued, his jaw tight. "We are born with it. We learn to control it. The wolf and the man coexist." Another pause, heavier. "That balance is breaking in me." "Breaking how?" Saren asked before she could stop herself. Calder's gaze cut to hers, sharp and assessing, like he was deciding whether she could handle the truth. Then he seemed to decide she could, or perhaps that she deserved to know, and something in his posture shifted. "I lose control," he said. "Not often, not yet, but the episodes are growing more frequent and more severe. My wolf surfaces without warning, overrides my thoughts, my decisions. I shift involuntarily. I become something that does not distinguish between ally and enemy." The weight of what he was saying settled over Saren like a stone blanket. The king of Ashenmoor was losing himself to his own wolf. The most powerful alpha in the realm was being consumed from the inside. "How long?" she asked. 8 months since the first episode. They were mild at first. A flash of instinct during a council meeting, eyes shifting color, heightened aggression. "I could suppress them." His mouth thinned. "I can no longer suppress them reliably." Saren glanced at Hadric, whose expression confirmed everything the king was saying and added a layer of fear the king himself would never admit to. "Who knows?" she asked. "The 3 people in this room," Calder said, "and 2 senior guards who have witnessed episodes and have been sworn to silence. 5 people. 5 people standing between the king and a secret that would tear the kingdom apart if it escaped." "And me?" Saren said quietly. "Now I know." "Yes," Calder said, and his voice carried an edge that could have been regret or warning. "Now you know." Marin stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Your Majesty, if I may." Calder gestured for her to speak, and Marin turned to Saren with the careful precision of someone about to deliver news she had been assembling for some time. "The bond mark is not decorative," Marin began. "It is functional. The sacred bond between a fated mate and an alpha of the ruling bloodline serves a specific biological purpose. It anchors the wolf." Saren's pulse spiked. "A bonded alpha is a stable alpha," Marin continued. "The mate's presence, her proximity, her scent, these regulate the wolf's dominance cycle. Without a mate, an unbonded alpha of sufficient power will eventually lose equilibrium. The wolf consumes the man." "Are you saying," Saren said slowly, "that without a mate, the king will go feral?" Nobody answered, which was an answer in itself. Saren looked at Calder. He was watching her with an expression she could not read, his hand still gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. How long does he have? She asked Marin, though her eyes stayed on the king. At the current rate of deterioration, Marin said, perhaps 4 months, maybe less. The room was very quiet. This is why Lord Voss kept me hidden. Saren whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. He knew. He knew you needed a mate to survive, and he made sure you would never find one. Calder flinched, barely perceptible, but she saw it. That is our conclusion as well, Hadric said from the doorway. Saren's hands were trembling in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs and forced herself to think clearly. What do you need me to do? Stay, Calder said, and the word came out rougher than he clearly intended. He cleared his throat. We need to determine if proximity to you stabilizes the episodes. Marin has proposed a controlled arrangement. Controlled arrangement, Saren repeated. You would be given chambers adjacent to the king's quarters, Marin explained. Close enough for the bond's calming effect to operate during the night, when the episodes are most severe. During the day, you would continue to have freedom of movement within the castle. Adjacent chambers, Saren echoed. Not in his room, then. She was surprised by the small, sharp sting of something that was definitely not disappointment. There are conditions, Calder said, his voice clipped and businesslike in a way that felt deliberately constructed. This arrangement is strictly practical. You are not a prisoner here, despite how you arrived. You will be compensated for your time, and if at any point you wish to leave, you are free to do so. He paused, and something cracked in the composure. I will not cage you again, he said, quieter now, and the words carried a weight that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the iron mask sitting in an evidence room somewhere in the castle. No one will cage you again. That is my word. Saren stared at him. Her throat felt thick, and her eyes burned with something fierce and unexpected. Nobody had ever promised her freedom before. Nobody had ever thought she mattered enough to promise anything to. I will stay, she said. The relief that flickered across Calder's face was so brief she nearly missed it. But she caught it, and it settled in her stomach like a coal, small and warm and impossible to ignore. That evening, Saren was shown to a chamber connected to the king's quarters by a single door. The room was simple but comfortable, furnished with more care than she had expected. Fresh linens, a thick wool blanket, a window overlooking the same courtyard she had seen from her first room, but from a higher vantage, closer to the sky. She pressed her palm against the glass and watched the last light drain from the horizon. Somewhere beyond the connecting door, she could hear him moving, the creak of a chair, the rustle of papers, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a large man trying to be quiet in his own space. Her mark pulsed faintly on her cheek, warm and insistent, responding to his proximity like a compass finding north. Saren pressed her fingers against it and whispered to herself in the dark, "What have I agreed to?" Through the wall, she heard his footsteps pause, then resume, then stop again, closer to the shared door this time, as if he had walked toward it without meaning to. Neither of them opened it, but neither of them moved away. The arrangement, as everyone insisted on calling it, began that first night with the shared door closed between them. Saren lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of him through the wall. The creak of his bed frame when he shifted, the occasional low exhale that could have been frustration or exhaustion or both. At some point, she heard his breathing change, rougher, faster, and then a thud like a fist hitting wood, followed by the sharp scrape of furniture being shoved aside. Then silence. Saren sat up in bed, her heart hammering. She stared at the connecting door. Something beneath her skin stirred, faint and unfamiliar, like an instinct she had never been taught to name. It pressed toward the door the way his footsteps had pressed toward it the evening before, a pull that lived below thought, below reason. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and willed it still. In the morning, Hadric informed her that the king had experienced a mild episode during the night. His wolf had surfaced briefly, violently, shattering the chair beside his bed before Calder wrestled it back under control. The adjacent chambers are not close enough, Marin concluded after 3 more nights of the same pattern, each episode worse than the last. Each morning, Calder's face a little more drawn, a little more hollowed out, the shadows beneath his eyes deepening like bruises. The bond's calming effect requires closer physical proximity. How much closer? Saren asked, though some part of her already knew the answer. Marin looked at her steadily. Same room, ideally within arm's reach. Saren opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You want me to sleep in the king's chambers. I want you to sleep within range of the bond's stabilizing radius, Marin corrected. The king's chambers happen to be where the king sleeps. Saren gave her a withering look that Marin absorbed without flinching. Calder resisted the idea with a ferocity that would have been flattering if it were not so insulting. He was not an invalid. He did not require a nursemaid. He would manage his own wolf, as he had been managing it for months, and he would do so without subjecting a woman he barely knew to the indignity of sleeping on his floor. The refusal lasted exactly 2 nights. On the second night, the episode was severe enough that Hadrick had to physically restrain the king while 2 guards barricaded the door. In the morning, 4 claw marks were gouged into the stone wall beside his bed, deep enough to fit a finger inside. A cot appeared in the king's chambers that evening. It was positioned against the far wall, separated from his bed by the full width of the room, as though the extra 12 feet of distance might preserve whatever shred of propriety remained. Saren arrived after the household had retired, carrying nothing but a change of clothes and the nagging sensation that her life had become fundamentally absurd. The king was sitting on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, head bent forward, looking nothing like the fearsome alpha who had ordered prisoners processed from his throne. He looked tired. He looked human. I will not be any trouble, Saren said, setting her things down beside the cot. Calder glanced up at her, his expression carefully blank. You are already trouble. She froze, stung, and he must have seen it on her face because he added, much quieter, that was not an insult. Saren did not know what it was then, but she let it go. She smoothed the blanket on the cot with more attention than the task required, and tried to ignore the fact that she was standing in the king's bedroom. Do you prefer silence or conversation? She asked. Silence, he said immediately. Understood, Saren replied. And then, because she could not help herself, the cot is terrible, by the way. Just so you know. He stared at her. Not a complaint, she added quickly. Just an observation. It is the kind of cot that makes you question your life decisions. Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. He suppressed it ruthlessly, but Saren saw it, and the sight of it sent a flicker of warmth through her that had no business being there. She lay down. He extinguished the candles. The room dropped into darkness, and the only sounds were the fire crackling and the distant wind pressing against the windows. Saren waited. She counted her heartbeats, then his breaths, slower now, steadier than the nights before. Minutes passed. She heard the subtle shift in his breathing, the gradual loosening, the moment his body surrendered to something it desperately needed. He was asleep. In the morning, she woke before him and watched the dawn light creep across the floor toward his bed. He slept on his back, one arm thrown across his chest, his face slack and unguarded in a way that made him look younger, softer, like a sketch of the man he might have been without the weight of a kingdom pressing down on him. No episodes, no claw marks, no shattered furniture. She slipped out before he woke and felt something warm bloom behind her ribs that she refused to examine too closely. The routine formed over the following days. In the mornings, Saren left his chambers before the palace stirred and spent the day exploring the castle, helping Marin in the healing wing when she was needed, learning the corridors and the gardens and the rhythm of a life that was not a cage. In the evenings, she returned to his rooms after sundown, set up her cot, and prepared to sleep. Calder mostly ignored her during these evening transitions. He sat at his desk reviewing correspondence, or standing at the window in a posture of deliberate stillness that radiated tension like heat from a forge. They did not speak beyond the minimum necessary, but things appeared. A thicker blanket on her cot one evening, folded neatly, clearly not from the servants' stores because the wool was too fine. A pillow that was actually comfortable, replacing the flat, punishing thing she had been enduring without complaint. A small iron lantern on the table beside her bed, already lit when she arrived, its amber glow warming the corner of the room. Thank you for the blanket, Saren said on the third evening, untying her hair. Calder did not look up from his desk. I do not know what you are referring to. The one made of wool that probably costs more than everything I have ever owned combined. The servants must have replaced it. And the pillow? Also the servants. And the lantern that appears already lit every evening, as if someone walked over and did it before I arrived? A pause. Coincidence, he said. Saren bit back a smile and said nothing more. On the fifth night, Calder could not sleep. She could hear him in the darkness, the restless shifting, the controlled breathing that was too deliberate to be natural. His wolf was close to the surface. She could feel it through the bond, a pressure against her senses like the air before a storm. The mark on her cheek pulsed steadily, warm and urgent. "Tell me something," he said into the dark. The request startled her. Something about what? Anything. Something unimportant. Saren thought for a moment. When I was small, before Lord Voss found me, I lived near a village that held a goat race every autumn. The goats were supposed to run through the market square, but they never cooperated. One year, a goat climbed onto the baker's roof and refused to come down for 2 days. The whole village stood in the square arguing about how to retrieve it. Someone suggested luring it down with turnips. Someone else said goats hate turnips. This started a secondary argument about goat dietary preferences that lasted longer than the actual goat situation. Silence from the bed. The goat eventually came down on its own and ate the turnips, Saren added. More silence. Then, very quietly, "What happened to the baker's roof?" "Destroyed." The baker was furious. He demanded the goat's owner pay for repairs. The owner said it was the race organizer's fault. The organizer said it was the goat's fault. They took it to the village elder, who ruled that the goat was an act of nature and therefore no one's responsibility. A sound from the bed. Low and brief and unmistakable. Calder had laughed. It was barely a breath of sound, bitten off almost immediately. But Saren heard it, and her whole body went still. She lay in the dark with her heart beating too fast, feeling as though she had just witnessed something impossibly rare, like seeing a shooting star burn all the way to the ground. She started talking to him every night after that, not about anything important. Village stories, childhood fragments, observations about the castle's architecture, or the gardener's ongoing feud with a family of persistent crows. Calder never asked her to continue, but he never asked her to stop either. And his wolf retreated faster on the nights she spoke, the episodes softening from violent surges to faint ripples that barely disturbed his sleep. One morning, as she was leaving, he said without looking up from his desk, "The crows. Did they get into the herb garden again?" Saren stopped in the doorway, stunned. He had been listening. He remembered. "Yesterday," she managed. Marin was furious. "Marin is always furious," Calder said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, and Saren left the room feeling like the ground beneath her feet had shifted in a direction she could not name. Then, on the 9th night, everything changed. Saren woke to a sound that was not human, a low, guttural snarl that vibrated through the floor and into her bones. She sat up fast, her pulse spiking, and saw Calder on the bed, his body rigid, his back arched, his hands twisted into the sheets so tightly the fabric had torn. His eyes were open, but they were not his. They were gold, bright and burning and utterly animal, and the sound coming from his throat was the sound of a wolf fighting to break free of a body that would not let it go. "Calder," Saren whispered. He did not hear her. His body convulsed, and she saw the ripple beneath his skin, muscles shifting in ways that were not natural, bones threatening to reshape. She was off the cot before she could think. She crossed the room in 3 strides, reached for him, and pressed both hands against his chest. The world vanished. Saren was somewhere else. The transition was not gradual. There was no fading, no blurring. One moment she was standing in the king's chambers with her palms pressed against warm skin. The next she was standing in a forest that should not exist. The trees were enormous, ancient beyond comprehension, their trunks black as burned bone, and their canopies so dense they blocked out everything above. No sky, no stars, no moon. The only light came from something deep within the wood itself, a faint bioluminescent pulse that throbbed through the bark like a heartbeat. The roots were immense, breaking through the surface of the ground in dark, gnarled ridges that twisted around each other like the fingers of something buried and trying to claw its way free. The air was thick and hot and tasted of iron and pine and something older, something primal that bypassed her thoughts entirely and spoke directly to the animal part of her brain. Run, it said. Saren did not run. Where am I? She whispered, and her voice came back to her in layers, as though the trees were repeating it, tasting it, deciding what to do with her. The thing beneath her skin stirred again, the same faint, wordless instinct she had felt through the connecting door on that first night. It was stronger here, more insistent, pressing against the inside of her ribs like something trying to unfold. She did not know what it was. She did not know why it felt like recognition. A sound ahead of her. Not a voice, but something larger, something that moved through the undergrowth with the deliberate patience of an apex predator that had never needed to hurry. The ground trembled faintly beneath each footfall. The wolf emerged from the shadows between two massive trunks, and Saren stopped breathing. It was immense, larger than any wolf she had ever seen or imagined, its shoulders level with her chest, its body a mass of dark fur and coiled muscle that radiated power the way a bonfire radiates heat. Its eyes were the same burning gold she had seen in Calder's face moments ago, and they fixed on her with an intelligence that was not human but was far more than animal. This was not a dream. This was the veil. The space between man and beast where the wolf lived, where it paced and waited and grew stronger with every episode that fed it. And somewhere inside this creature, Calder was trapped. The wolf lowered its massive head and snarled. The sound was so deep Saren felt it in her teeth. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to cower, to submit. But the thing beneath her skin pushed back, rising to meet the wolf's presence with a quiet, stubborn force that was entirely its own. I know you, Saren said, and she was shaking, her entire body vibrating with terror. But her voice came out steady. You are part of him. You are not separate. The wolf's ears flattened. It took a step forward, and the ground groaned beneath its weight. He is not your enemy, Saren continued, holding her ground through sheer force of will. And I am not your prey. The wolf lunged. Not at her, past her, around her, circling with a speed that turned the air into a whipping wind that stung her skin and tangled her hair. It was testing her, probing, trying to determine what she was. The displaced air carried its scent, wild and electric and overwhelmingly familiar in a way that made no sense because she had never been here before. Saren closed her eyes and reached for the bond. She could feel it here, stronger than in the waking world, a golden thread that connected her chest to something deep inside the wolf's. She pulled. The wolf stopped moving. Its massive head swung toward her, eyes narrowing. Come back, Saren whispered. Please. She reached out and placed her hand on the wolf's muzzle. The fur was coarse and hot, almost feverishly so, and beneath it she could feel the rapid hammering of a pulse that was not quite animal and not quite human. The wolf shuddered. Its golden eyes flickered, and for one fractured moment she saw Calder behind them, trapped, exhausted, fighting to hold on. Then the veil shattered. Saren gasped and stumbled backward, and she was in the king's chambers again, her hands still on Calder's chest. He was human, breathing hard, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and clear and terrified. He stared up at her. What did you just do? He demanded, his voice wrecked. Saren pulled her hands back slowly, her own heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. I went inside, she said, into the space where your wolf lives, the veil. I touched it, and I was there. Calder sat up abruptly, pushing away from her, swinging his legs off the bed and putting distance between them so fast it felt like a slap. That is not possible, he said, and yet it happened. He was on his feet now, pacing the length of the room with the caged energy of something barely contained. She could see the tremors running through his hands. You cannot go there, he said. Do you understand? That place is not meant for anyone. The wolf is not a thing that can be reasoned with. If it had turned on you, if it had attacked, I could not have stopped it. But it did not attack, Saren said. This time, he spun to face her, and the raw fear in his expression made her lungs seize. I cannot control what happens in the veil. I barely survive it myself. Every episode the wolf takes more, and I come back with less. If you are in there when it finally wins, you will not come back at all. The words hung between them, heavy and absolute. Calder, Saren said softly. She used his name deliberately, and she saw the impact of it cross his face like a wound. Do not, he said, his voice cracking. Do not make this harder. Make what harder? The arrangement is over, he said, and each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. You will return to the quarters you were given initially. Hadrick will ensure you are comfortable. Saren felt the blood drain from her face. You are sending me away. I am keeping you alive. By removing the only thing that keeps your wolf from consuming you entirely? He flinched like she had struck him. That is my burden to carry, not yours. It stopped being only your burden the moment I touched you and landed in that forest, Saren shot back, and her voice was rising now, heat flooding into it. I felt it, Calder. I felt the bond. I felt you inside that creature, and I pulled you out. You cannot ask me to pretend that did not happen. I am not asking, he said, and his voice dropped into something cold and final. I am ordering, as your king. The title was a wall, deliberate and cruel, not Calder, the king, a man she had no right to argue with, no standing to challenge. Saren stared at him across the dark room. The lantern he had lit for her every evening flickered on the table beside the empty cot. Fine, she whispered. Your Majesty. She watched the words land, watched him absorb the formality like a blade to the ribs. Then she turned, gathered her things with hands that shook only slightly, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle, not turning around, and said, The wolf did not attack me because it knew what I was. Whatever you think you are protecting me from, the bond is already inside me. Sending me away does not undo that. She left without waiting for a response. In the corridor, alone, she pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall and felt the mark on her cheek pulse once, twice, then dim to something faint and aching, like a heart learning how to break. 3 days without him, and Saren could feel herself unraveling. It started subtly, a heaviness in her limbs that sleep could not lift, a persistent chill that no fire could reach, as though something essential had been withdrawn from inside her, and the cold had rushed in to fill the space. Her appetite vanished. Food tasted like dust, and the effort of lifting a spoon felt disproportionate to the reward. By the second day, the mark on her cheek had faded from its usual golden-violet glow to a dull, muted bronze, like a flame being starved of air. The thing beneath her skin that had stirred in the veil, the faint, wordless instinct that had risen to meet the wolf, had gone silent, not dormant, grieving. By the third day, the migraines began. Sharp, blinding pulses that drove her to her knees in the corridor outside the healing wing. She pressed her palms against her temples and breathed through the pain, slow and measured, the way Marin had taught her. But beneath the physical symptoms, there was something worse. An absence, a wrongness that lived in the center of her chest where the bond had been forming, growing, reaching towards something it could not find. It felt like homesickness for a place she had never been allowed to call home. Saren told no one. She moved through the castle like a ghost, performing the motions of normalcy with decreasing conviction. She helped Marin sort herbs. She ate meals she could not taste. She smiled at servants who spoke to her and forgot what they said the moment they walked away. She did not see Calder. Not once. He had vanished into the upper corridors of the castle, and Hadrick, when she cornered him, would only say that the king was managing and that his orders stood. Managing, Saren repeated flatly. Hadrick's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes told a different story. They told the story of a man watching two people destroy themselves for noble reasons and being powerless to stop it. Is he sleeping? Saren asked. That is not something I can discuss. Is he having episodes? A pause, a fraction too long. I cannot discuss that either. Saren nodded slowly, and the dread in her stomach solidified into something dense and immovable. On the fourth morning, she woke to find her pillow damp with tears she did not remember crying. The mark on her cheek was barely visible, a ghost of itself, and the chill in her bones had settled into something permanent. Marin found her in the herb stores that afternoon, grinding valerian root with hands that trembled so badly the pestle kept slipping. Sit down, Marin said, in the voice she used when she was not going to tolerate argument. Saren sat. Marin took her wrist, checked her pulse, looked into her eyes, then held her face and studied the faded mark with an expression that grew progressively grimmer. How long since you have slept properly? Marin asked. I sleep, Saren lied. How long since you have eaten a full meal? Saren said nothing. Child, Marin said, and her voice softened in a way that cracked something open behind Saren's ribs. The bond is incomplete. It was forming, strengthening every night you spent near him, and now the separation is tearing it apart. Your body is responding to the break. It is just fatigue, Saren managed. It is not fatigue. It is rejection sickness. The bond is reaching for him and finding nothing, and your body is interpreting the absence as loss, as grief. Marin paused. It will get worse. How much worse? Marin did not answer, which was answer enough. On the 5th day, a summons came. Not from the king, from the council. Councillor Drafton, the oldest member of the king's advisory body, had requested Marin's presence to address concerns about the king's recent behavior at court. Marin was indisposed with a patient who could not be moved, so she sent Saren in her place to deliver her written assessment. Just hand them the document and leave, Marin instructed. Do not linger. You are in no condition for confrontation. Saren took the sealed report and made her way to the council chamber, on legs that felt increasingly unreliable. The corridors stretched and contracted around her in ways that could not be real, and she had to stop twice to lean against the wall and let the dizziness pass. The council chamber doors were open. Voices carried from inside, tense and overlapping. She could hear Drafton's gravelly insistence, Hadrick's measured deflections, and beneath them, a voice that made every nerve in her body ignite with desperate, devastating relief. Calder. Saren stepped through the doorway and nearly staggered. He was at the head of the table, standing, his hands braced against the wood. He looked worse than she had feared. The hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to cast shadows. His skin had taken on a gray undertone that spoke of sustained, punishing exhaustion. The veins on the backs of his hands were prominent, standing out in dark ridges that pulsed faintly, and she knew with sickening certainty that the wolf was closer to the surface than it had ever been. He was dying, she could see it. I have a report from Healer Marin, Saren said, and her voice sounded thin and distant even to her own ears. For Counselor Drafton. She crossed the room toward the elderly counselor, acutely aware of Calder to her left. She willed herself not to look at him, not to falter, not to let the bond's frantic pull show on her face. She looked at him anyway. She could not help it. Her eyes found his, and the impact was physical, a jolt that ran through her like being struck by lightning. He was already looking at her. His expression was something she had never seen on his face before. Hunger and horror and heartbreak all compressed into a single devastating instant. His eyes swept over her faded mark, her thinned frame, the tremor in her hands, and she watched comprehension hit him like a blow. He saw what the separation was doing to her. He saw it, and it broke something behind his eyes. Saren reached Drafton's seat and set the report on the table. Her hand shook so violently, the paper rattled against the wood. The sound was louder than it should have been in the sudden silence. Thank you, Drafton began. The room tilted. Saren felt it happen. The way the floor seemed to rise toward her and the walls bent inward and the light went thin and white at the edges. She heard the report slide off the table. She heard her own breath catch. She heard, from very far away, a chair crash backward and heavy footsteps cover the distance between the head of the table and where she stood in what could not have been more than 2 strides. His name was the last thing on her lips before the darkness took her. She felt the impact of arms catching her before she felt the fall. She felt herself being pulled against a chest that shook with barely restrained fury and terror in equal measure. She felt hands cradling her head, tilting her face upward, fingers pressing against the pulse point in her throat. Get Marin, Calder snarled, and his voice was barely human. Now, someone ran. Multiple someones. The room erupted into movement, but Saren could not see any of it because her eyes would not open and her body would not respond, and the only thing she could feel was the bond in her chest, blazing back to life at his touch like a fire finding air. She came back to herself in the healing wing. The light was soft and amber, and Marin was adjusting a herbal compress against her forehead, and Calder was sitting beside her bed. Not across the room. Not standing at a professional distance. Sitting beside her, close enough that his knee pressed against the mattress, his elbows on his thighs, his head in his hands. When he heard her stir, he looked up, and the expression on his face was so raw, so devastated, so furious at himself, that Saren's eyes filled with tears before she could form a single word. "You idiot," she whispered. His jaw clenched, but he did not argue. He could not. The evidence of his idiocy was lying in a healing bed with a faded bond mark and hands that still trembled. "How long has she been like this?" he demanded, turning to Marin without taking his eyes off Saren. "Since you sent her away," Marin replied calmly. "The incomplete bond is degrading in both directions. Her body is failing because the bond cannot find its anchor. And your wolf," she added, fixing him with a look that would have made a lesser man flinch, "is destabilizing faster without her because the bond was the only thing slowing the process." Calder went very still. "Both directions," he repeated. "Both directions," Marin confirmed. "You are killing each other with distance." The silence that followed was immense. "There is more," Marin continued, her voice dropping. "I have been researching the bond's mechanics since this began. The sacred mark does not just identify a mate. It initiates a bonding process that, once started, cannot be reversed." She looked at Saren, then at Calder. "The process began the moment you first touched in the throne room. Every night she spent in your chambers accelerated it, and now that it has reached this stage, the bond must either be completed or it will consume you both." "Completed," Saren whispered. "Or consume you both," Calder said flatly. Marin nodded. "You have perhaps 3 weeks before the deterioration becomes irreversible. In you, that means full feral transformation with no return. In her, it means organ failure." Saren watched Calder's face as Marin spoke. She watched the weight of it settle onto shoulders that were already carrying more than any man should bear. She watched him look at her fading mark, at the poultice strapped to her wrist, at the tremor in her fingers, and she watched the moment he understood that his protection had become the weapon. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and rough and shaking, and the contact sent a wave of heat through her that made her vision swim with relief. The mark on her cheek flared, bright and sudden, its golden violet light casting shadows across the pillow. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. Saren squeezed his hand and held on. Marin kept Saren in the healing wing for 2 days. Calder did not leave. He tried to, twice. He stood, made it 3 paces toward the door, and stopped. The first time, he turned back with a muttered excuse about needing to review Marin's treatment notes. The second time, he did not bother with an excuse. He simply returned to the chair beside her bed and sat down like a man who had lost an argument with his own legs. Saren watched him from the pillow and said nothing, but the mark on her cheek glowed steadily brighter with every hour he stayed, and they both knew what that meant. Hadric came and went, delivering reports and correspondence that Calder reviewed without moving from the chair. The beta's expression remained carefully neutral, but on his third visit, he set a stack of documents on the side table and said, very mildly, "The council is wondering where you are." "Your Majesty, the council can wait," Calder replied without looking up. Hadric's gaze flicked to Saren, then back to the king. The ghost of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face before he turned and left. On the second evening, Marin declared Saren well enough to leave the healing wing. Her vitals had stabilized. The mark had regained most of its color. The tremor in her hands had stopped. "The proximity is working," Marin told them both. "But proximity alone will not be enough for much longer. The bond needs to complete, or the deterioration will resume." She left the room with the particular briskness of a woman who had said everything that needed saying and was done repeating herself. Saren and Calder stood in the empty healing wing, alone for the first time since the night he had sent her away. The silence between them was thick with everything unsaid. "I should return to my quarters," Saren said carefully, testing the words. "Your quarters are being relocated," Calder said. "Adjacent to mine was clearly insufficient." Marin recommends the previous arrangement. The cot, Saren said. The cot, he confirmed, and then added, so quietly she almost missed it, which I have been told is a crime against furniture. Saren blinked at him. He had remembered. The walk back to his chambers was slow. Saren's body was still recovering, and Calder matched her pace without comment, adjusting his long stride to hers with an unconscious attentiveness that made her throat tight. They did not speak, but he stayed close, and twice his hand hovered near her elbow when she wavered on a stair, withdrawing the moment she steadied. His chambers looked the same. The cot was still against the far wall, the lantern still on the table beside it, but the blanket on the cot was different, thicker, and beside the lantern someone had placed a small bundle of dried lavender tied with string. Saren picked it up and held it to her nose. The scent was soft and calming, familiar from her hours in the healing wing, and she knew with absolute certainty that no servant had placed it there. She looked at Calder, who was standing by the window with his back to her, his shoulders a rigid line against the fading sky. Calder. He did not turn. Look at me. He turned slowly, and what she saw in his face made her knees weaken. He was barely holding on. The composure he wore like armor was cracked down the center, and through the cracks she could see everything he had been trying to bury. The fear, the exhaustion, the loneliness that had been eating him alive long before the wolf started destabilizing. And beneath all of it, something so fierce and desperate it made her eyes sting. This past week, he said, his voice raw, I could feel you fading. Through the bond. Like a light dimming at the edge of my vision, and I could not reach it. His hands clenched at his sides. I told myself it was necessary, that the distance would protect you, that I could endure it. Could you? Saren asked softly. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I stopped eating on the second day. I could not taste anything. The wolf was surfacing every few hours, and I could not fight it because I did not have the strength. And I did not have the strength because the only thing that gave me strength was across the castle, dying because of my decision. His voice fractured on the last word. I cannot do this without you. I have tried. I am not strong enough. Saren crossed the room. He watched her approach like she was something dangerous and inevitable. She stopped directly in front of him. You do not have to do this without me, she said. That is what I have been trying to tell you. If the bond completes and something goes wrong, he started. Then it goes wrong with me beside you, not across a castle, wondering if you are still alive. She reached up and placed her palm against his cheek. The contact sent a shock through them both, the bond flaring hot and bright, and she felt his sharp intake of breath against her wrist. Saren, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like surrender. I spent years behind a mask, she said, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Years in the dark with no one. I have already survived the worst thing I can imagine, and it was being alone. Her voice thickened. Do not ask me to be alone again, please. He made a sound that was not quite a word, agonized and longing, and his hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm harder against his face, turning his head just slightly to press his lips against the center of her palm. The kiss on her hand undid her. She surged up and pressed her mouth to his. The kiss was graceless and desperate and tasted of salt, and Calder responded like a dam breaking. His arms wrapped around her and lifted her off the ground entirely, pulling her against his chest as his mouth moved over hers with a hunger that stole the air from her lungs. We should stop, he breathed against her lips, even as his hands spread across her back, pulling her impossibly closer. Why? She whispered back. He pulled away just far enough to look at her, his gray eyes bright and wild and searching. Because if we do not stop, I will not be able to. And the bond will complete, and everything changes, and I need you to be certain. Saren looked at him, at the fear in his eyes, the need, the devastating vulnerability of a man who had been strong for so long he had forgotten how to ask for anything. I have been certain since the moment you lit the lantern for me, and pretended you did not, she said. Something broke open in his face, not composure this time, but the last wall, the final barrier, the thing he had built between himself and the possibility that he might deserve what she was offering. His mouth found hers again, and this time there was no hesitation. He carried her to the bed, his arms steady beneath her, his lips never leaving hers. The world narrowed to sensation and warmth and the overwhelming rightness of finally being where she was meant to be. He set her down gently, and his hands trembled as they moved to her face, tracing the mark on her cheek with reverent fingers. What followed was slow at first, achingly tender, both of them holding each other with the careful attention of people who understood what it meant to be treated gently after years of rough handling. The connection between them deepened into something that existed beyond thought, beyond language, beyond anything Saren had a name for. When the moment came, when the bond crested and the instinct took hold, Calder pressed his face against her throat and bit down. The mating bite, ancient and claiming, and the bond snapped into place with a force that made the world ring like a bell. Saren felt it flood through her, golden and fierce and complete. A connection that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone, all the way down to the place where the quiet thing beneath her skin had been waiting her entire life. It surged now, rising to meet the bond with a force that shook her to her foundations. Not dormant, not silent, awake. Her wolf, unnamed and unknown until this moment, answering his at last. She bit him back, her teeth finding the muscle where his neck met his shoulder, and his answering groan vibrated against her skin. The bond flared brighter, sealed now from both directions, locked and whole. They held each other afterward, breathing hard, the warmth of the room settling around them like a blanket. Calder pulled her against his chest, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, strong and even and calm in a way she had never heard it before. Sleep, she murmured against his skin. He obeyed, his body going heavy and warm beneath hers, his arms tightening around her even as consciousness left him. Saren felt herself follow, pulled under by exhaustion and warmth and the bone-deep satisfaction of a bond finally complete. Her last thought before sleep took her was that she had never felt safer. She woke in the vale. The forest was different this time. The massive black trees were still there, towering and ancient, but the bioluminescent pulse that had throbbed through their bark was dimmer now, weaker, like a heartbeat faltering. The air was colder than before, and the iron taste had sharpened into something that burned the back of her throat. "Calder," Saren called out, and her voice did not echo. The forest swallowed it whole. She walked forward, barefoot on ground that yielded too softly beneath her steps. The bond hummed in her chest, a golden compass, and she followed it through the dark until the trees thinned and opened into a clearing she had not seen before. Calder was on his knees in the center of it, not the king, not the alpha, not the man who had held her with such tenderness an hour ago. This version of him was stripped bare, hollowed out, wearing the expression of someone who had been kneeling for a very long time and had forgotten how to stand. The wolf stood behind him, not circling this time, but still, its massive body pressed against his back like a shadow given weight and form. Its golden eyes found Saren, and they were not hostile. They were tired. "Calder," Saren said, dropping to her knees in front of him. "Look at me." His eyes were open but distant, fixed on something beyond her. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. At the far edge of the clearing, where the trees pressed in like a closing fist, figures stood in the darkness, dozens of them. Men, women, some heartbreakingly young, standing motionless in rows that stretched back into the shadows. Their faces were smudged with ash. Their clothes were burned, charred at the edges, smoke still rising from the fabric in thin, curling wisps that never dissipated. The prisoners. Understanding hit Saren like a physical blow, and she tasted bile in the back of her throat. These were the prisoners from Voss's compound. The ones in the lower cells, the ones nobody knew were there, the ones who burned. "Tell me," Saren whispered, taking his hands. They were ice cold and rigid. Through the bond, the memory came. Not in words, but in images, sounds, sensations that crashed through her mind like a wave breaking over rocks. The siege of Voss's compound. The walls breached at dawn after 3 days of fighting. Calder's forces pouring through the gap, meeting resistance on every level. Fire arrows, oil pots. The kind of desperate defensive measures that turned a battle into an inferno. Voss's soldiers had set the lower levels ablaze to destroy evidence of the supply routes, the smuggled weapons, the intelligence that would have exposed his network of allies across the northern border. They had not thought about the prisoners chained to the walls below. Calder had heard the screaming from inside the courtyard. He had smelled the smoke and the burning and the something else that no soldier ever forgot. He had ordered his men to breach the lower cells, but the fire was already too deep, the heat too intense. 3 of his soldiers had died trying. In the aftermath, they had found 57 bodies. Men and women who had been locked in Voss's cells for crimes that ranged from dissent to simply being in the wrong place. They had burned alive while the battle raged above them. Saren had been in the upper cells, separated from the others, kept behind an iron mask in a room with a lock that required a key only Voss carried. When the fire reached her level, a retreating soldier had kicked her door open, not out of mercy, but because he was fleeing and the door was in his way. She had crawled out through smoke and chaos and collapsed in the courtyard, where Calder's men found her. She had survived because Voss considered her valuable. 57 others had not. The knowledge carved through Saren like a blade, and she understood now, fully and completely, what the veil was. It was not just the wolf's domain. It was the space where Calder kept the things he could not carry in the waking world. The guilt, the grief, the unbearable weight of having won a war and lost the people he was fighting to save. The wolf was not consuming him because it was a beast without reason. The wolf was growing stronger because Calder was feeding it. Every night, he came to this place and knelt before the dead and offered himself as punishment. And the wolf, bound to his emotional state, gorged on the guilt and grew larger and more feral and less controllable, which only confirmed what Calder already believed. That the beast inside him was monstrous. That he was monstrous. That he deserved to be consumed. One of the burned figures stepped forward. A boy, small and slight, his face half obscured by ash. He looked at Calder with eyes that held no accusation, only patience, the terrible patience of the dead who had nowhere else to be. "You could have been faster," the boy said, and his voice was Calder's. The words were Calder's own guilt given a mouth and a face. "You could have breached the walls sooner. A better king would have known they were there." "Stop," Saren said, her voice breaking. She squeezed Calder's hands. "That is not his voice. Those are your words, not his. You are doing this to yourself." Calder's head dropped. "You breached a fortified compound in 3 days," Saren said, her voice fierce even as tears streamed down her face. "You sent soldiers into a burning building to save people you did not even know were there. 3 of your own men died trying to reach them. You did not fail those prisoners. Voss failed them. Voss chained them there. Voss set the fire. You were the one trying to put it out." "I was not fast enough," Calder whispered. "No," Saren agreed, and the word landed hard. "You were not fast enough, and that is a tragedy. A real, terrible, unfair tragedy that you will carry for the rest of your life. But it is not evidence that you are a monster." She released one of his hands and reached behind him to touch the wolf. Its fur was hot beneath her palm, its breathing shallow and rapid. It flinched at her touch, then stilled. "This creature is not your punishment," Saren said. "It is part of you. The same part that heard the screaming and ordered his men into the fire. The same instinct that drove you to fight for people you had never met. You have been at war with yourself since the day those cells burned, and the war is killing you because you will not let it end." Calder looked up at her, and his eyes were raw, stripped of every defense, every wall, every carefully constructed barrier. The man beneath the king, beneath the alpha, beneath the armor. "I hear them," he said. "Every night, I hear them screaming, and I cannot reach them. I will never be able to reach them." "I know," Saren whispered. She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away tears he probably did not know he was shedding. "I know what it feels like to be trapped and to believe you deserve it. I wore that mask for years, and every day I told myself it was because I was not worth saving. That if I had been better, someone would have come." Her voice cracked, and she let it. "But that is the lie, Calder. The mask was not my fault, and the fire was not yours. We do not earn suffering by being imperfect. We just suffer, and then we have to choose whether to keep punishing ourselves or to put it down and live." She turned to the figures standing at the edge of the clearing. The burned, the lost, the ones who would never leave this place because Calder would not let them go. You deserve rest, she told them. All of you, and so does he. For a long suspended moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath, the wolf held its breath. Even the darkness seemed to pause. Then Calder's hands tightened around hers. I am sorry, he said to the figures. Not a plea, not a performance. A statement of fact, spoken to the dead by a man who had carried their weight long enough to buckle beneath it. I am sorry I was not fast enough. I am sorry I could not save you. I will remember you for the rest of my life, but I cannot stay here anymore. The boy looked at him for a long time. Then the ash on his face began to lift, drifting upward like embers rising from a dying fire. One by one, the figures dissolved. Not into darkness, but into light, soft and pale and golden, floating upward through the black canopy like lanterns released into a sky that had not been there a moment ago. The wolf exhaled, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to empty its entire body. It pressed its massive head against Calder's back, and Saren watched the impossible happen. The wolf began to shrink, not disappearing but integrating, sinking into Calder like light being absorbed by skin, the boundaries between man and beast blurring and softening until they were no longer two things fighting for dominance but one thing, whole and complete, the way it was always meant to be. Calder gasped, his body shuddered, and then he was falling forward into Saren's arms, and she caught him, held him, bore his weight as the last of the veil dissolved around them. I have got you, she whispered against his hair. I have got you. She woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm golden light of early morning. The fire had burned down to embers, and the lantern on her table had guttered out, but the light coming through the windows was the softest, warmest thing she had ever seen. Calder was already awake. He was looking at her with an expression that made her heart do something complicated and wonderful. His eyes were clear, truly clear, for the first time since she had known him. The shadows beneath them had not vanished entirely, but they were lighter. The gray undertone in his skin was gone, and his hands resting on her waist were steady. The wolf? She asked. Quiet, he said, and he smiled. Small, fragile, genuine. For the first time in months, quiet. Saren smiled back and felt tears slide down her cheeks. He brushed them away with his thumbs, his touch gentle enough to make her want to stay in this moment forever. The bond hummed between them, warm and golden and whole, complete in a way that went beyond biology, beyond magic, beyond anything either of them had words for. The wolf did not vanish overnight. Calder still had episodes in the weeks that followed, moments where the beast surged and his eyes flickered gold and his hands trembled with the effort of control. But they were different now, shorter, less violent, more like waves breaking on a shore than storms tearing through a city. And Saren was always there, her hand in his, her presence an anchor that the wolf no longer fought against but leaned into. He talked about the war. Not all at once, not easily, but in fragments that emerged during late nights and early mornings, when the world was quiet enough to hold hard truths. He spoke their names, the soldiers who had died in the fire, the prisoners whose faces he had memorized from the recovery reports, the boy whose image had lived in the veil long after the real child had been laid to rest. You are allowed to remember them, Saren told him one night, her head on his chest, her fingers tracing slow circles on his arm. You are allowed to grieve, but you are also allowed to live. He pressed his lips against her hair and did not answer, but she felt the tension leave his body, and that was answer enough. Their bonding was, predictably, the scandal of the season. A masked prisoner of unknown parentage as the Alpha King's fated mate was not what the court had envisioned for the bloodline. The whispers followed Saren through every corridor, every banquet, every official function where she stood beside a king and felt the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing down on her shoulders. On their wedding day, she wore a gown that left the bond mark on her cheek fully visible. No mask, no veil, no covering of any kind. She walked the length of the great hall, with the golden violet spiral blazing on her skin for every member of court to see, and when she reached the altar where Calder stood waiting, the look on his face made every whisper, every doubt, every cruel word dissolve into nothing. They will get used to it, he murmured against her temple afterward, holding her close in the corridor outside the great hall while the celebration carried on without them. And if they do not? Saren asked. Then they can take it up with their king, he said, who happens to be hopelessly and permanently devoted to his mate and is not remotely interested in opinions to the contrary. Saren laughed, and the sound echoed off the stone walls, bright and full and free. Months later, on a morning like any other, Saren woke slowly to pale light filtering through the curtains of the king's chambers. Their chambers now, the room that had once felt like a stranger's space was hers, filled with her books, her dried herbs, her collection of small stones from the courtyard garden that she arranged on the windowsill in patterns that only made sense to her. Calder slept beside her, his face peaceful, his breathing deep and even. One arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her close even in sleep, the way he always did, like he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. The bond mark on his shoulder, the one she had given him, glowed faintly in the morning light. No episodes, no golden eyes in the dark, no wolf clawing at the walls of its cage. Just a man, sleeping beside the woman who had found him behind the beast and brought him home. Saren watched him for a moment, warmth blooming in her chest like the first light of morning. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the quiet hold them both.